Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. You're becoming a burden in this house, Helen, my daughter-in-law said across the dinner table, as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the kitchen doorway. I looked down at my plate and watched the steam curl up from the pot roast I had spent 3 hours preparing. My son Ryan sat 2 chairs away. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't defend me. He simply stared at his dinner as though the conversation had nothing to do with him. I was 71 years old, and in that moment, sitting in the home where I had lived for nearly 3 decades, I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. 8 months earlier, my husband Charles had passed away after 42 years of marriage. Grief had changed many things, but I never imagined it would change my family this much. When Charles was alive, the house felt warm. It felt full. There was always laughter in the kitchen, football games on television, grandchildren running through the hallway, and plans for future holidays. After he was gone, the room seemed larger and quieter. At first, I told myself everyone was grieving in their own way. Ryan became more distant. Courtney became more impatient. I excused every sharp word and every forgotten phone call because I wanted to believe we were still a family. That evening, however, something shifted. Courtney set down her fork and folded her hands neatly on the table. "We're just worried about you," she said. "You don't really do much anymore. The house is a lot to maintain. Maybe it's time to start thinking about other arrangements." Other arrangements. The word settled heavily in my chest. I glanced around the dining room. The framed family photographs. The china cabinet Charles built with his own hands. The curtains I had sewn 20 years ago. Every corner of that room held a memory. Yet somehow they were discussing my future as if I weren't sitting there. "I'm doing fine," I said quietly. Courtney smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "Of course you think that." Ryan finally looked up. For one hopeful second, I thought he might say something different. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Maybe Courtney has a point, Mom." That hurt more than anything his wife could have said. I finished my dinner in silence. When the meal was over, I carried my plate to the sink, rinsed it carefully, and thanked them for joining me. Neither of them noticed how tightly I was gripping the edge of the counter. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom and closed the door behind me. The house was quiet. Through the window, I could see the porch light glowing against the dark Connecticut night. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at Charles's photograph on the nightstand. For months, I had convinced myself that the tension in the house was temporary, that grief was making everyone act differently. But deep down, I knew the truth. They no longer saw me as the woman who built this family. They saw me as an obstacle. And as I sat there in the silence, I realized something that would change everything. If they truly believed I was powerless, they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, just as I had for most of my adult life. The house was still quiet. For a few minutes, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee warming my hands, I allowed myself to pretend nothing had changed. The familiar scent of coffee filled the air. The first pale light of morning slipped through the windows above the sink. It almost felt normal. Then I noticed something small. My favorite chair at the breakfast table was gone. It had always sat beside the window. Charles used to joke that nobody else could claim it because I had occupied it for too many years. Now another chair sat in its place. Mine had been moved to the far end of the room near the laundry door. I stood there staring at it longer than I should have. When Courtney came downstairs an hour later, she barely looked up from her phone. "We rearranged a few things yesterday," she said. "The room flows better this way." I nodded. I did not argue. A chair was only a chair. At least that was what I told myself. Over the following days, similar changes appeared everywhere. Family conversations happened without me. Weekend plans were discussed after decisions had already been made. Packages arrived addressed to Ryan and Courtney. New furniture appeared. Old photographs quietly disappeared from shelves and walls. The changes were subtle enough that an outsider might not have noticed them. But I noticed everyone. This house carried the story of my life. I knew every picture frame, every drawer, every scratch in the hardwood floors. One afternoon, I returned from grocery shopping and found workers measuring the living room. They carried clipboards and tape measures. Courtney explained they were exploring renovation ideas. Nobody had mentioned renovations to me beforehand. "It is probably time for an update," she said with a smile. I set the grocery bags on the counter and unpacked them in silence. Later that evening, I walked through the house alone. The upstairs hallway felt different. The family photographs that once showed birthdays, graduations, and vacations had been replaced by decorative artwork. In the den, several boxes sat stacked against the wall. Curious, I opened one. Inside were framed pictures, keepsakes, and small items that belonged to Charles and me. Objects that had once been displayed proudly were now packed away like forgotten decorations after a holiday season. I carefully closed the box. That night, I sat in bed with an old photo album resting on my lap. The pages were filled with decades of memories. There was Ryan at age 8 holding a baseball glove. There was our first family barbecue in the backyard. There was Charles smiling beside the vegetable garden he loved so much. Looking through those photographs, I realized the hardest part was not the furniture being moved or the decorations being changed. It was the feeling that my place in the family was being erased one small step at a time. Nobody announced it. Nobody admitted it. Yet I could feel it happening all around me. And the more I paid attention, the more I began to wonder whether those changes were leading toward something much bigger than I had first imagined. The following Sunday, Ryan and Courtney hosted a family lunch. It was the kind of gathering that used to make me happy. The dining room filled with familiar voices, grandchildren laughed in the backyard, and the smell of grilled burgers drifted through the open patio door. From the outside, everything looked normal. But once you know where to look, you start seeing things you missed before. I arrived at the table carrying a bowl of potato salad I had made that morning. For years, I had always sat beside the window near the head of the table. That seat had never been assigned. It had simply become mine after decades of family dinners. This time, a decorative place card sat there with Courtney's name written in elegant lettering. My place card waited at the far end of the table beside a folding chair that had been added at the last minute. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody explained it. I simply picked up my plate and sat where my name told me to sit. During lunch, conversations flowed around me without ever quite including me. Ryan talked about future renovation plans. Courtney discussed new furniture. Several relatives nodded and offered suggestions. I listened carefully. The strange thing was that every plan involved the house where I lived, yet nobody asked for my opinion. At one point, I opened my mouth to comment on a contractor Ryan mentioned. Before I finished my sentence, Courtney smiled and said, "That was a long time ago, Helen. Things are done differently now." The conversation immediately moved on. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody said anything. I looked down at my plate and continued eating. Later, while dessert was being served, one of my granddaughters asked if I would still be living there next Christmas. The room grew unexpectedly quiet. She was only 10 years old. Children often repeat things they hear without understanding them. Courtney laughed quickly and changed the subject, but I noticed Ryan staring into his coffee cup. The question stayed with me long after everyone went home. That evening, I walked through the empty house once again. I passed the living room where Charles and I had spent countless evenings together. I passed the staircase where family photographs used to hang. Each room seemed to whisper the same uncomfortable truth. The small humiliations were no longer isolated incidents. They formed a pattern. A chair moved. A photograph removed. A decision made without me. A comment disguised as concern. Separately, each one seemed harmless. Together, they told a very different story. For the first time, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. I was not. Something was happening beneath the surface, and I could feel it becoming more obvious with every passing week. As I prepared for bed, I remembered something Charles used to say whenever he sensed trouble coming. Pay attention to what people do when they think you are not watching. Standing alone in the quiet hallway, I realized I had spent months looking at what my family was saying. It was time to start paying attention to what they were doing. That night I could not sleep. The house settled around me with the familiar creaks and soft noises that had once brought comfort. Instead, they seemed to sharpen my thoughts. I found myself remembering conversations from years earlier, moments I had not considered important at the time. Charles had always paid attention to details. He noticed patterns long before anyone else. Looking back, I realized how often he had quietly protected me from things I never even knew were happening. The next morning, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were photo albums, letters, and keepsakes collected over more than 40 years of marriage. I had not looked through most of them since Charles passed away. One by one, I lifted the items carefully. Old birthday cards, vacation photographs, handwritten notes tucked between pages. Each object carried a memory. As I sorted through everything, I found a small envelope addressed in Charles's handwriting. My name was written across the front. The sight of it stopped me cold. I sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it slowly. Inside was a short note. It was not dramatic. It was not mysterious. It was simply Charles being Charles. He wrote about trust. He wrote about family. And near the bottom, he included a sentence that stayed with me long after I finished reading. He had written that people often reveal their true intentions during times of change. At the time he wrote it, I doubt he imagined how meaningful those words would become. Later that afternoon, I drove to the cemetery. The sky was gray, and a cool breeze moved through the trees. I stood quietly beside Charles's headstone for nearly an hour. I told him things I could not say to anyone else. I told him about the awkward dinners, the missing photographs, the growing feeling that I no longer belonged in the home we had built together. Most of all, I told him about Ryan. That was the part that hurt the most. Courtney's behavior disappointed me, but Ryan's silence wounded me in ways I struggled to explain. I had raised him. I had stayed awake through fevers, school projects, broken hearts, and difficult years. Yet somehow we had reached a point where he watched these things happen without saying a word. On my drive home, I stopped for coffee at a small cafe Charles and I used to visit on Saturday mornings. Sitting by the window, I watched people come and go. Young families, retired couples, friends meeting for lunch. Life continued moving forward. As I sat there, something inside me began to shift. For months, I had been reacting to everything that happened around me. I had been waiting for someone else to explain what was going on, waiting for someone to tell me I mattered. But perhaps I had been asking the wrong questions. Maybe the issue was not why things were changing. Maybe the real question was who was benefiting from those changes. For the first time, I stopped looking backward at what my family had become and started looking forward at what they might be planning. And once that thought entered my mind, I could not ignore it. 2 days later, I received the answer to the question that had been lingering in my mind. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Rain tapped softly against the windows while I folded laundry upstairs. Ryan and Courtney had returned home earlier than usual. Their voices drifted up from the kitchen. First, I paid little attention. Then I heard my name. Instinctively, I paused. I was not trying to eavesdrop, but when people discuss your future as though you are not there, it becomes difficult not to listen. I stepped quietly into the hallway. Their voices were low but clear enough. "The sooner we do it, the easier it will be," Courtney said. "She cannot stay here forever." There was a long pause before Ryan answered. "I know." Hearing those 2 words felt like a weight settling in my chest. Not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed what I had been afraid to believe. I remained perfectly still. Courtney continued speaking. She mentioned a senior living community about 20 miles away. She talked about floor plans, waiting lists, and monthly costs. She spoke with the efficiency of someone discussing a home improvement project. Then she said something that made everything else suddenly make sense. "Once the house is sold, we can finally move forward with our plans." Sold. The word echoed in my mind. I looked around the hallway where family photographs had once hung. I thought about the renovations, the measurements, the missing keepsakes, the conversations that excluded me. Every piece clicked into place. Ryan spoke again, his voice uncertain. "What if she refuses?" Courtney sighed. "She will not have many options. Eventually she will understand." I waited for him to object. I waited for him to remind her that this house had been my home for decades. I waited for him to say something that sounded like the son I remembered raising. Instead, there was only silence. After several moments, the conversation shifted to other topics. I returned quietly to my bedroom before they could notice me. Once inside, I closed the door and sat in the chair beside the window. Outside, the rain continued falling across the backyard. The maple tree Charles planted years ago swayed gently in the wind. For a long time I simply sat there thinking. Oddly enough, I did not cry. The sadness was still there, but something stronger had begun to replace it. Clarity. For months, I had been living inside a puzzle without understanding the picture it formed. Now I could finally see it. They believed my future had already been decided. They believed I would quietly accept whatever arrangements they made. Most of all, they believed they understood exactly how much power I had left. That assumption would prove far more important than they realized. As evening settled over the house, I opened my desk drawer and removed a small leather folder Charles had once told me never to throw away. At the time, I had not thought much about it. Now, for the first time in months, I felt compelled to see what was inside. And deep down, I had a feeling that whatever I discovered next was about to change the entire story. The next morning, after Ryan and Courtney left for work, I carried the leather folder downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the worn edges of the cover. I remembered seeing Charles handle it dozens of times over the years. At the time, I never paid much attention. We trusted each other completely. There was never a reason to question how things were organized. Slowly, I opened it. Inside were neatly arranged documents, notes, and contact information. Most of it appeared ordinary at first glance. Insurance papers, property records, financial statements. But then I noticed a business card clipped to the inside pocket. It belonged to Michael Hargrove, the attorney who had worked with Charles for nearly 20 years. I had not spoken to him since the funeral. Without allowing myself time to second-guess the decision, I picked up the phone and called his office. To my surprise, he remembered me immediately. When I explained that I wanted to review a few matters Charles had handled before his passing, he offered to meet the following afternoon. The drive to his office took about 40 minutes. During the trip, I found myself rehearsing questions I was not entirely sure how to ask. Part of me worried I was overreacting. Another part suspected I had already ignored too many warning signs. When I arrived, Michael greeted me warmly and led me into a quiet conference room overlooking a small courtyard. For a few minutes, we exchanged polite conversation about Charles. Then his expression grew more serious. "Helen," he said gently, "is there a particular reason you wanted to review these documents now?" I hesitated before answering. "I think there are things happening in my family that I do not fully understand." He nodded as though that explanation told him more than I realized. Over the next hour, he carefully reviewed file after file. Occasionally, he would point out details Charles had established years earlier. Details I had either forgotten or never fully appreciated. The deeper we went, the more surprised I became. Certain protections had been built into the estate. Certain decisions required my approval. Certain assets remained entirely under my control. None of it matched the assumptions Ryan and Courtney seemed to be making. Finally, Michael closed the last folder and folded his hands. "Helen," he said, "from everything I am looking at, nobody can make major decisions regarding this property without your direct authorization." I stared at him for several seconds. "You are certain?" He nodded. "Very certain." A strange calm settled over me. For months, I had felt as though the ground beneath me was slowly disappearing. Now, for the first time, I understood something important. The future Ryan and Courtney had been planning existed only because they believed I did not know the truth. As I left the office, the afternoon air felt lighter. I was not angry. I was not triumphant. I was simply awake. And as I drove home through the quiet Connecticut streets, I realized I no longer needed to guess what was happening. The real question now was whether I would let them continue believing they were in control. When I returned home from Michael's office, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would not confront Ryan. I would not argue with Courtney. I would not reveal anything I had learned. Instead, I would watch. Over the following weeks, I became the version of Helen they already believed existed. I stayed quiet during conversations. I smiled politely when plans were discussed around me. I listened more than I spoke. The less I said, the more comfortable they became. Courtney seemed especially pleased. She walked through the house with growing confidence, discussing paint, colors, furniture layouts, and future improvements as though the decisions had already been finalized. Ryan gradually adopted the same attitude. One evening, I overheard him talking on the phone about long-term plans. He spoke as though remaining in the house was inevitable. Hearing it no longer upset me. In fact, I found it strangely useful. Every assumption they made revealed another piece of what they were expecting. A few days later, Courtney invited a real estate agent to visit. She explained that they were only gathering information about market values in the neighborhood. The explanation sounded casual, but I noticed how eager she seemed. As the agent walked through the property, taking notes and asking questions, nobody bothered to ask whether I wanted a stranger evaluating the home. Once again, I remained calm. I offered coffee. I smiled. I thanked the agent for visiting. The more cooperative I appeared, the less guarded everyone became. Meanwhile, I quietly met with Michael twice more. Together, we reviewed every document carefully. There were no surprises anymore. The facts were clear. The protections Charles had established remained fully intact. More importantly, every major decision still depended on me. Knowing that changed something inside me. For months, I had felt trapped by circumstances. Now I understood that my greatest advantage was patience. One Saturday morning, Courtney sat across from me at breakfast and mentioned a senior living community again. This time she showed me brochures. Beautiful photographs filled the pages. Landscape gardens, activity rooms, comfortable apartments. She presented everything with practiced enthusiasm. You would have so many opportunities there, she said. New friends, new activities, less responsibility. I studied the brochure carefully before handing it back. It looks very nice, I replied. The relief on her face was immediate. She clearly interpreted my response as acceptance. Ryan looked relieved as well. Neither of them realized I was simply gathering information. As summer approached, the atmosphere in the house changed. Courtney seemed happier than she had been in months. Ryan appeared, increasingly confident about the future. They believed events were moving exactly as planned. In a way, they were right. Plans were moving forward, just not the ones they imagined. One evening, while watering flowers near the front porch, I looked up at the house Charles and I had built together. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn. For the first time since his passing, I felt completely steady. I was no longer reacting to other people's decisions. I was preparing my own. And the day was coming when everyone in that house would finally learn the difference. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. One Tuesday evening, Courtney announced that she wanted everyone together after dinner because there were important family matters to discuss. The confidence in her voice immediately caught my attention. Ryan seemed unusually relaxed as well. Throughout the meal, they exchanged small glances that reminded me of people who believed a long-awaited goal was finally within reach. When dinner ended, Courtney cleared her throat and folded her hands on the table. We have been thinking a lot about the future, she began, and we believe it is time to make some decisions that will benefit everyone. I listened quietly. Ryan nodded in agreement. Courtney continued speaking about practicality, convenience, and long-term planning. She mentioned maintenance costs, property taxes, the responsibilities of managing a large home. Everything was presented as concern. Everything was wrapped in careful language. Then she placed a folder on the table. We have gathered some information, she said. We thought it might help if we looked at options together. Inside the folder were brochures, market reports, and notes regarding senior living communities. There were also documents related to selling the property. The sight of them would have shocked me months earlier. Now I simply turned the pages calmly. Ryan finally spoke. We just want what is best for you, Mom. I looked at him for a moment. His expression seemed hopeful, almost relieved. It was obvious that he expected resistance. He expected tears. He expected a difficult conversation. Instead, I surprised them. Both. I agree, I said. It is time to discuss the future. Courtney's shoulders visibly relaxed. The smile that appeared on her face lasted only a second, but it told me everything I needed to know. She believed she had one. For the next 20 minutes, I listened while they described their vision for the months ahead. They talked about timing, logistics, financial benefits. At one point, Courtney even began discussing possible renovations after the property changed hands. The assumption behind her words was impossible to miss. By then, they were no longer asking what I wanted. They were discussing what they expected would happen. Eventually, I closed the folder and placed it neatly on the table. You have clearly spent a lot of time planning this, I said. Ryan smiled. We have been trying to think ahead. I nodded thoughtfully. That is good. Because I have been doing the same thing. For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed their faces. The room became very quiet. I stood and walked to the kitchen counter where my phone rested beside a small stack of papers. Returning to the table, I placed the documents in front of them. Then I made a brief call. Less than 15 minutes later, there was a knock at the front door. Courtney looked confused. Ryan looked concerned. I rose calmly and opened the door. Standing on the porch was Michael Hargrove carrying a leather briefcase. The expression on Ryan's face changed instantly. Courtney stared at the attorney in complete silence. As Michael stepped inside, I realized the moment I had been preparing for had finally arrived. For months they had believed they were guiding the future. They had never considered the possibility that I had already prepared one of my own. Michael entered the dining room with the calm confidence of someone who already knew every fact that mattered. He greeted Ryan and Courtney politely before taking a seat beside me. For a moment nobody spoke. The atmosphere that had felt so certain only minutes earlier suddenly became uncomfortable. Michael opened his briefcase and removed several folders. Then he began explaining the documents in clear, simple language. He reviewed the estate structure Charles had established years before his passing. He explained ownership rights, decision-making authority, and the protections that had been carefully put in place. As he spoke, I watched Ryan's expression change. Confusion became concern. Concern became realization. Courtney sat completely still. The confidence she had displayed all evening slowly disappeared. When Michael finished, the facts were impossible to misunderstand. No sale could move forward without my approval. No transfer could occur without my authorization. No major decision regarding the property belonged to anyone except me. The silence that followed felt very different from the silences I had endured over the previous months. This time I was not the one being ignored. Ryan finally looked at me. "Mom, why did you not tell us?" he asked quietly. I considered the question for several seconds. "Because nobody asked," I replied. My voice remained calm. There was no anger in it. No satisfaction either. Just honesty. I explained how I had watched changes unfold throughout the house. How family decisions had gradually excluded me. How assumptions had replaced conversations. I told them about the afternoon I overheard plans being discussed for my future without my involvement. Neither of them interrupted. For once they listened. Courtney lowered her eyes. Ryan looked exhausted. The truth was sitting in front of all of us. The problem had never been paperwork. The problem had been respect. After Michael left, the three of us remained at the table. The house felt strangely quiet. Eventually I spoke again. I explained that I had already made several decisions. The property would remain under my control. Certain financial arrangements would be updated. Future planning would happen differently than anyone had expected. Most importantly, I would no longer allow other people to decide what role I should play in my own life. Over the following months, those decisions transformed everything. Some family relationships required time to heal. Others changed permanently. Ryan worked hard to rebuild trust. Courtney became noticeably more careful with her words and actions. As for me, I stopped apologizing for taking up space in the home I had helped create. One autumn evening, I sat on the front porch watching golden leaves drift across the yard. The air carried the crisp scent of the approaching season. For the first time in a very long while, the house felt like home again. Not because the walls had changed. Not because the documents had changed. But because I had changed. I finally understood something that should have been obvious all along. Growing older did not make me less valuable. Grief did not make me powerless. And the people who underestimated me had unknowingly given me the greatest gift of all. They forced me to remember exactly who I was. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.